All right, for all intents and purposes, I'm supposed to say what caused the Great Depression. For all intents and purposes, I'm talking about from 1929 when the stock market crashed to 1941 with the outbreak of World War II. The depths of the Great Depression came in 1932 with 25% unemployment. Tramps and hoboys, etc., looking for work. And some people have attributed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 with causing the Depression. It raised the average tariff from an extreme of 38.5% to a staggering 53%. There is no question it made things worse. It may have taken the country from a recession, which is what we had right after the stock market crashed, to a depression, but it couldn't have caused it. The increase in tariffs were enacted to counteract the unemployment that followed the crash of Wall Street. Now, I'm not saying that Henry Ford caused the Great Depression, but it would be very easy to think that he did. In 1909, Ford introduced the Model T. In 1913, he introduced the moving assembly line. And for the next 13 years, he kept making essentially the same car he was selling in 1909. From 1909 to 1927, he built cars, trucks, buses, and fire engines, you name it, on the Model T chassis. Now, what enabled cars to be built on the moving assembly line? Well, I'm told that it was the secret of interchangeable machine parts, that he had a couple of Danish engineers working for him, and they figured out how to do it. Previously, they had figured out interchangeable parts for rifles and then later sewing machines, but they hadn't figured out how to make them for industrial type heavy duty machinery like cars and trucks, so on. So that was the key to his success. And once the parts were interchangeable, the assembly line could move and the workers could stand still. Now, Ford paid $5 a day, twice what his competitors, Chrysler and Chevrolet, were paying. What did that give him?
A very loyal workforce.
Yeah, a very fast workforce, for sure. High wages equaled high production, equaled high profits. 4 cars were produced every minute, 240 per hour, nearly 6,000 cars a day. So you ask, why do people work in factories instead of producing their own food, clothing, and shelter? Did people work for Ford because 60,000 workers produced 6,000 cars a day? Because each worker made a car in 10 days instead of a lifetime? Or because they got better food, clothing, shelter than they could have produced themselves, plus an automobile? In 1925, you could buy a pickup truck for $381. The price of a Ford car went from $850 in 1909 to $290 in 1925. In today's dollars, that's a little over $28,000 to a little over $5,000. An 82% reduction in the price, and you could buy a car on credit. Half the cars in the whole world were Fords, the most widely used vehicle in human history. By 1925, 60% of American families own one kind of car or another. Now, where did the majority of Americans live before 1920? On farms and rural areas. And in the 1920s, agriculture was still employed a very large percentage of the population. By the 1920s, anything that could be sold in large quantities could be made on the assembly line. There were many companies making tractors, including those like the Caterpillar with tracks on it. In 1922, Ford cut his tractor prices nearly in half. And by 1925, Ford had sold over 500,000 tractors and captured 70% of the market. You could buy a truck or a tractor for less than a team of horses. And farm equipment was proliferating with manure spreaders, pickers, threshing machines, balers, and 6 million tons of commercial fertilizer were used every year. Horses were being replaced for logging, hauling, farming. Horse feed had required 1 out of every 5 acres. Therefore, that's 20% more farmland available to grow food for sale. More land was producing food for the market, and the increased supply was reducing the price. But I don't think it was the increase in the supply of food that was the only reason farmers could not pay their mortgages. And as we know, in 1920, there was a recession, and the price of farmland fell, and a lot of farmers went bankrupt. I believe the biggest reason they couldn't sell all the food they were growing was that Europe was growing their own food at the end of World War I, and the demand for American food fell dramatically because of it. As machines replaced workers, where did the workers go? To the cities to work in the emerging factories. Every business that finds a way to produce things cheaper expands their operations, lowers their prices, increases their sales, and makes greater profits. Isn't that how Henry Ford became the second richest man in the world? You know who the richest man was? The Duke of Westminster. Was it the west side of London? Factories were being built and worked in by people who were being replaced by machines, farmers and teamsters, the increase in population, including immigrants from other countries. Immigration was reduced, but people were still coming and more factories were being built. Housing was being built for workers in the cities and in the suburbs, which were being developed because of the affordable car could now take people to the city and back every day. Roads were being paved, bridges were being built, electric generating stations were constructed, and wires were being strung. Electric lights were proliferating, along with electric-powered refrigerators, washing machines, radios, irons, fans, and toasters that were being bought and used in more and more homes. By the mid-1920s, 70% of urban dwellings and over 20% of farms had indoor plumbing. Electric was being supplied to factories, illuminated by electric lights that were clean and healthy, with electric machinery that was more versatile and compact, with electric elevators which allowed multi-story factories. They could operate day and night around the clock with many more workers per acre than before. Steel and reinforced concrete in the elevator now made possible the high-rise buildings that were epitomized by the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings at the end of the 1920s. Telephones became standard with real-time communication, and every product created jobs making components like steel, rubber, and glass for automobiles. The economy was booming, and it seemed like nothing could possibly stop it. Then, between 1929 and 1930, the greatest economy in the history of the world had collapsed. Henry George says, take the case of any one of these vast masses of unemployed men. In his own wants, in the needs of his anxious wife, in the demands of his half cared for, perhaps even hungry and shivering children, there is demand enough for labor. Heaven knows, in his own willing hands is the supply. Put him on a solitary island with a few hand tools, and though cut off from all the enormous advantages which the cooperation, combination, and machinery of civilized community gives to the productive powers of man, his two hands can fill the mouths and keep warm the back that depend upon them. Yet, where productive power is at its highest development, they cannot. Why? So what caused the Great Depression of the 1930s, where 25% of the people were unemployed? As more land was devoted to crops for feeding people instead of horses, and machines were grossly more efficient, the supply of food increased. By 1919, Europe was growing more of its own food. World War I was over. The price of food went down. What happened to the value of land that grew food? It fell. What happened to the demand for and the value of land that was needed for new factories in and near the cities along the rivers? Went up. You couldn't build a factory in a cornfield in the middle of Kansas very well. You needed the river, the railroad, access to electric, water, and gas. What happened to the value of land needed for housing workers? It went up. What happened to the value of agricultural land near cities that had lost its value for growing crops, but was now connected by paved roads and cheap cars to the factories along the river? As the value of land went up with the increase in productivity, what happened to the incentive to sell? Are people more or less likely to sell when the price of land is going up? The value of gold and silver are going up right now. It's expected to go up even more. What are people saying? It's a great time to sell? I would imagine that most of what is being sold is coming from mines. It's gold that hadn't been extracted yet. The faster the price of land is bid up by those who stand to make enormous profits from selling cheap manufactured products, the less likely the owners of unused land are to sell. How many times can you sell the same piece of land? Once. Technology replaces workers. It also enables more workers per acre. Electricity enables lighting and elevators, which in turn enable factories to operate floor upon floor upon floor, 24 hours a day with compact electrical powered machinery. It requires less land, but it increases the rental value and the prices that are being offered for land, which increases the incentive not to sell. And it looks like every increase in productivity generates the expectation of even greater productivity going forward. And the banks loan more and more money to people who offer higher and higher prices. At some point, when the income from those expectations don't come through, people start missing payments and the banks withdraw credit. People offer less to buy land and less land is sold. The economy can no longer expand. Where are all the workers that were replaced by trucks, tractors, and farm machinery going to be reemployed? You can't put two things in the same place at the same time. The land could be sold at any price or even given away, and there wouldn't be any less land. Land has no cost of production. It's always been here. But not enough land was sold, and the economy couldn't reemploy everyone who was replaced by machines. I suggest to you that is phase one of a depression. As workers who have lost their jobs also lose their purchasing power, there is a reduction in the demand for goods already produced. That's phase two. As more people get laid off, the less demand for goods. The less demand for goods, the less need for workers to produce them, and more people get laid off. The less demand for goods, the fewer sales and profits, which means the stockholders are able to buy less as well. With less demand for goods and services, what happens to the demand for land that's needed to produce them? It falls as well. The price that's offered for land tends to fall again. If the analysis were based on its own merits, it seems reasonable that the depression would be over before it began. Let's say that the value of land is increasing by 6% and the return on capital is 5%. you wouldn't sell your land. You'd say, well, the land's increasing better than the return of my capital. I'm getting a better deal. But then the value of land starts increasing at only 4% and the return on capital is 5%. You would sell. So if it was based on its own merits, it would be over before it began. But nonetheless, apparently the psychology always prevails and people don't sell. All the while, bridges, highways, hydroelectric dams were being built and provided cheaper transportation and electricity, including increasing the results of labor and making the land more profitable. Wages and interest fell, labor and capital became more productive with inventions and the infrastructure, and landowners began to sell at lower prices. Slowly, the economy was picking up, but we know that World War II is what actually marked the end of the Great Depression. Now, in concept, any one of three things could end a depression or a recession. One, once the sellers of land have set a price at which they will sell. And once they've set that price, wages and interest fall enough, the price of land becomes affordable. Of course, wages and interest can only fall so much before people start getting hungry and weak and produce less. Even the skilled workers can only take so much, the higher paid workers can only take so much of a reduction in pay before they lose the incentive to accumulate the skill and knowledge. And productivity by way of the infrastructure and inventions and innovations and so on increases enough, the price of land becomes affordable. And if the price of land falls from what they initially decided they would sell it for, if it falls enough that it becomes profitable, the economy would be over. Now, some combination of all three of these contributes to the end of all depressions and recessions. And we've seen it in these recent recessions. Wages fell, interest rates fell, and the price of land fell. Now, we've all heard of the artificial demand for labor created by war and armies. But in fact, we can also know when we think about it, that it wasn't a real artificial demand for labor that created the wartime prosperity. Land had to go into production to feed and clothe the soldiers and make the weapons. The demand was real, and the workers did have access to land. Raw materials were extracted. Land was used for shipyards, truck, tank, aircraft, and munitions factories. So when people say there was an artificial demand, well, maybe a little bit of an artificial demand for labor to go and shoot each other, but there was a real demand, a real access to land in order to fight the war. And that's where I think that there's a misconception. Now, going to Germany, we're at the end of the Great Depression, 1939. They said they needed living room in Poland, and they marched in and took some of it. And the Italians went into Ethiopia because they said they needed farmland. And the Japanese went to Manchuria because they said they needed raw material. And the question in my mind is, did they absolutely use their own land that they already had to its fullest extent? Now, it's true that Japan had and still has virtually no natural resources, but they seem to be doing pretty well since the war without those resources. And I don't think that you could say that any country in the world had put all their resources to full use before they went and tried to take them from another country. So here's my hypothetical territory here. And there's no free land, you notice in there. And I've got an automobile factory here on the left side of the river, which is where the little village is, and a tractor factory. It's 1921. And there are 3 tractors and 3 cars in the community. Each tractor replaces 1 farm worker, 5 more tractors and 5 more cars. 5 farm workers went to work in the new truck factory up here. 5 more tractors, 5 more trucks. Each truck replaces 1 worker. You see, there's all the trucks down here in the community. And we got 3 farm workers who are now paving the roads because they're not needed on the farms anymore. And 3 farm workers are now building electric and phone systems. And see, here's all the telephone poles. And 3 farm workers are now making farm machinery down here in the new factory. 1 farm worker's making refrigerators up here in the refrigerator factory. 5 more cars, 5 more tractors, 5 more trucks out into the community. 5 workers are replaced by tractors, 5 workers are replaced by trucks. And companies producing cars, trucks, tractors, farm machinery, roads, utilities, each gained 1 worker. And now 5 people who were replaced by machines would like to work in the proposed radio and appliance factories, but the owners of that land are holding it for speculation. There's no place to put the factory. So because the land speculators won't sell, 5 people are unemployed. There they are on the street. And you say, well, why won't they sell? Well, if we were talking about iced tea or cars, it would simply be a matter of somebody saying, oh, you only have 1 glass of iced tea left? Well, I'll pay you extra if you'll sell it to me. Oh, okay. And then what do? You run home, you make up some more iced tea for sale. Or cars, you sell whatever you have for what you can, and then you produce more cars. But how many times can you sell the same piece of land or an antique? You can't sell it but once. And so, of course, you hang on to it, hoping to get the most money you possibly can. Now, since there's no place to put the factory, the speculator won't sell. We have 5 people unemployed, and the unemployed workers don't buy new cars or appliances. The manufacturer can't sell any more stuff because they don't. The workers aren't buying it. The people who are unemployed aren't buying it. And so the 3rd shift ends in the auto factory over here. 2 more workers are unemployed. 2 more people are buying less goods and services. Another drop in sales. The refrigerator company closes down. Another workers unemployed and buying less. The tractor sales drop and the company lays off 2 workers down here. 2 more workers are unemployed and buying less. And the next thing you know, we're in a full-scale recession or depression. Simply because you can't put 2 things in the same place at the same time. Now, I'm just making this up as a parable to explain how recessions come about. And it said, the news said that the recession was caused by the housing crisis. So if that's so, you ask, how could that be? Well, let's take James. He builds individual homes on site. He employs 100 workers and he produces 20 houses per year. They lose a lot of time on account of the weather. You know, it's too cold, raining, snowing, sleeting. So he says, what if I built a factory? I could build houses rain or shine, day or night. With a factory, I could build 20 houses with only 60 workers instead of 100. The payments on the factory would be equal to the wages of 10 workers, and I would save 30% of my wages. I could have the houses delivered by truck and assembled in a day or 2. But you know, He says, if I was to build a really big factory, I could keep all 100 workers and I could make even more profit. The big factory, of course, the payments on it would be equal to hiring 16 more workers. But the big factory would yield 33% more homes with 100 employees. I could lower prices, expand sales, and increase my profits. Isn't that how Henry Ford became the second richest man in the whole world? Every time he was able to make things cheaper, he was able to sell more of the unit and make more money. Housing prices are going down. House sales are going up. What happens to the demand for farmland that's near the suburbs and suitable for building houses on?
Subdivisions.
Speculate, right? Suppose you were offered $1 million a year ago for your land. That's 10,000 per acre for a 100-acre farm. Now, a year later, you're offered 1,150,000, and you just made 15% on your asset by not selling. The price of houses keeps going down. The sale of houses keeps going up. The demand for land to put them on keeps going up. New homes are better insulated. Heating systems are more efficient. Housing requires less maintenance. The price of everything that's coming from China, we're talking about between 2000 and 2008, keeps going down. And all the savings give people more money to pay for the land on which to park a house. Now another year goes by and you're offered 1,400,000. That's almost 22% more than you were offered a year before for the same piece of land. You just made $250,000 by not selling. Are you more or less likely to sell now?
Let's keep holding it.
Yeah, right. And of course, somebody might think it's too good to be true and sell, but there's that tendency. My God, I made 22% of my investment. I think I'll just wait and see what I'm offered next time.
Hey, it can't go down, can it?
Right. It's not just land for housing that's going up in value. It's mineral land, manufacturing and commercial land, all the land that's needed to work and produce on, including land to put another housing factory on. As inventions, innovations, and new technologies increase productivity and the value of land, expectations of greater and greater production and greater and greater land values bring forth more and more and more credit. You probably heard those stories about people who were offered 120% of the value of their home for a home equity line of credit or something. They were just giving credit out like crazy. You didn't even have to document certain things. So then when those expectations fell short and those who have borrowed and bought land can't make the payments, credit starts to contract. The value of land begins to fall because those who want and need the land are unable to borrow enough to buy at what others have previously paid. We know that the value of anything is the most that anybody is willing to give for it in exchange. And at that point, the value of land was falling. But unfortunately, not enough of those who had unused land were actually selling it. And if the land is not available for all the houses that James is able to build, what was he going to do? Go back to making them one at a time when the weather permits, or lay off the third shift? Those guys that were on the third shift aren't working, and they won't be buying a new car or refrigerator. They won't be going on vacation. And that reduced the demand for cars, refrigerators, and hotel rooms at the beach. And people in those industries get laid off. They won't be buying a new house either. And that further reduces the demand for houses and the land needed to put them on. As soon as the price stopped going up, logic would suggest that the land would be sold for whatever was being offered at the time. But too many sellers wait for the price to go up again. productivity continues to increase, interest rates are lowered, and eventually the price of land falls enough that most of the land that's needed goes into production and most of the people can go back to work. Recessions end when enough land is put into production. One way or the other, land must be available for production in order to create jobs. Now, it's a matter of public record that land prices fall before recessions or depressions officially start. It's also noted that financing is withdrawn. Therefore, builders are able to offer much lower amounts, which lowers the market value of land. What is clear is that no matter how much the value of land falls, if it isn't sold or developed by the landowner himself, it can't be developed and no one can be employed on it. Now, Mike O'Mara, when's the next recession scheduled for? He probably can't hear me, but it's scheduled for 2020.
Yeah, I hear you.
2026,
Fred,
right?
Yes, Fred Foldbury predicts 2026. So unless there's some major upheaval.
And Fred Harrison predicts 2026.
And Phil Anderson as well.
Phil, what's his name?
Phil Anderson.
Phil Anderson, who is 150% sure, maybe I should say 200, like Kurt Churchill, 200% sure that the next recession is going to be 2026. And that's the end.